Everybody give a round of applause to Antony Butcher.
All right. Yeah. So, I'm going to introduce you to an unknown wonderful world, a horticultural marvel you've never heard of that hides a centuries-long tale of intrigue, exploitation, science, double standards, and maybe even the British responsibility for the death of thousands of Indians. Our journey begins with the founding of the East India Company in 1600. Its motto, where God leaves, nothing harms, swiftly changed to avoid any mention of avoiding harm. It had extraordinary powers. It could mint its own money, raise an army and a navy, and declare war on any non-Christian nations. In the 18th century, it realised that it could make more money if it didn't just trade with India, but owned India, and started a land and power grab that saw it becoming the Indian government. In the 1700s, the East India Company exercised power through 3 presidencies: Bengal in the east, Madras in the south, and Bombay in the west. In Bengal, a bad deal by the government, which was actually just the East India Company, meant they needed a new tax to continue to profit. So they increased the historic salt tax, which had already been exploited to take millions of rupees out of India and back to the UK. So for nearly a century, the salt tax in Bengal was significantly higher than the rest of India. So what? These days we're all being told to eat less salt, but it's actually essential for life. I've had to cut out all of the boring science, but basically, if you don't replace the salt that you sweat out regularly, then you'll die. Or you'll become more susceptible to other deadly illnesses, including India's notorious range of diarrhea, vomit, and fever-inducing illnesses, which accelerate the rate at which salt leaves the body. As ready meals and Big Macs weren't available in 19th century India, people had to buy salt and add it to their cooking. During the 1700s, new taxes more than tripled the price of salt in Bengal, meaning that in a good year, an average family's salt intake would cost an agricultural labourer a sixth of their annual income, and in a bad year, half. In 1804, the East India Company, still acting as the government of India, but now under the control of the Crown, passed a law allowing customs barriers to be placed on all roads and rivers outside of Bengal, making sure that those pesky Indians didn't take Indian salt out of India back into India without paying the British. So in 1823, the company really sets up a secondary line of customs houses and starts building a barrier in between them, occasionally using dead trees and bushes. And it's likely that this is where the idea for a great hedge came from, when some of those bushes began to self-root. In 1857, the British government kicked out the East India Company after its exploitative rule had precipitated the Indian Mutiny, yet still the hedge continued to grow, now under the oversight of a British government who decided to unify all of the various small border hedges into a single massive hedge. And oh boy, did they succeed. At its greatest extent, the inland customs line was 2,500 miles long, with a meticulously recorded 1,181.4 miles of hedge. It was utterly impregnable, up to 12 foot high, 14 foot wide, that's just less than 2 double-decker buses, and 2 heights of Rowan Atkinson tall. The length of the hedge was the same as driving from Land's End up to Manchester, across to the Penny Arcades of Scarborough, back to Manchester, up to Edinburgh, going to see if Glasgow's as scary as you think it is, running back to Edinburgh, because it probably is, and then going all the way to John O'Groats. That is a fucking long hedge. The hedge was manned by 12,000 underpaid staff, most of whom were expected to make their home out of materials foraged from the hedge. For context, last year the UK Border Force had only 8,000 members of staff. The hedge was suddenly and completely abandoned in 1869 when the salt tax was equalised across India. But the issue didn't go away. In 1930, Gandhi leads a famous salt march, you can see him there, viewing this as the first step to freedom. And he was right. In 1946, the first day of the interim government that led to Indian independence, Gandhi was observing his weekly day of silence. Nevertheless, he passed new ministers a note calling for the immediate abolition of the salt tax, and 6 months later it was finally repealed. Now, there's lots more I'd like to fit in this presentation, but couldn't. Roman soldiers received an allowance to purchase salt, the salarium, from which we get the word salary. In France, all citizens were required legally to buy a minimum amount of salt every week, and if you didn't, you could end up being a galley slave. A third of their galley slaves had broken the salt tax law. By 1850, half of all salt consumed in Bengal ridiculously came from England as cheap ballast. So by 1862, there was no legal salt production in the state, so 60,000 people were unemployed. So when famine struck in 1866, one civil servant told Parliament, "I'm afraid a considerable number of them were swept off the face of the earth." And this wasn't an isolated incident. Most ironically, the British stopped the salt tax in Britain in 1825, 50 years before India. Now, I want to leave you with one final thought. Arbitrary borders enforced by nationalistic governments cost lives, and those lives are never those of the rich, of the people with money, of people with power and privilege. It's the poor and the undertrodden. And I know that the situation isn't as simplistic as I'm making it out, but perhaps one day we'll look back at all borders as being as much of a folly as the Great Hedge of India and spend our time building bridges instead. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can see others on the Bettakultcha YouTube channel. Subscribe now and you'll be notified when new ones are uploaded.